All right, everyone. Hello. Welcome to our Saturn in Aries webinar. And I'm going to repeat something that we said just before we started the recording. And that is, I call myself a PowerPoint queen. And so all of these PowerPoint slides that you are going to see, they're going to be available as a PDF and it'll be on our YouTube channel when we post this, and it is in the description of the Saturn in Aries topic. So I always like to say you don't have to feel like you are always having to write everything down because you'll have these slides afterwards. If you have any questions, you are always welcome to either raise your hand or put it in the chat pane. Leroy is so good at answering questions for me, and if he wants to interrupt with anything he can't answer for us, you go ahead and do that, and you're welcome to do it as well.
And honey,
Uh,
let me insert right here that what I said earlier to the smaller group is that anybody hearing this recording, we're going to do several of these forecasting Zoom calls in the future. June 9th, we have Saturn in Cancer, or excuse me, Jupiter in Cancer. By the way, that's an anniversary for us. The first webinar we produced here at EAN was Jupiter in Cancer 12, 13 years ago around the houses. So that happens on June 9th. On July 2nd, we'll have the Uranus into Gemini. July 16th, Mercury retrograde in Leo. So when you get the notice, the link in your newsletter from EAN, just feel free to forward it to family, colleagues, and friends so we can build a big audience here live. And we'll always assist in getting the information out in the various ways, like Kim just mentioned with the PDF. All right, thank you.
Okay, Leroy, I'm going to have to change the date of the Mercury retrograde. We'll talk about that later. Right now, I've got it on the 14th, but we'll see how it goes with our travel schedule. We do whole house rentals in the summer, and I joke that I'm a laundress in the summertime. And so, with our travel schedule, we go camping and hiking when we rent the house out. So we may have to change that Mercury retrograde, but we'll discuss that later. Here's my housekeeping slide that you can see all of the hyperlinks of everything that we offer on our website. And a few years ago, for the Manitoba Astrological Society, I did a 6-hour workshop on all four of these planets ingressing into new signs, which they're doing this decade, as you can see, within a 4-year time period, which is very rare. And so it is what is so much of the chaos that we have going on right now on the planet. And tonight we're going to look at Saturn in Aries, adding to the chaos of change. And so here are your dates again, where Saturn dips into Aries. It's going to have one more retrograde cycle back into Pisces. I got some slides on that. But it's basically starting a brand new 28, 29, 30 years, 3 decade cycle around the zodiac. So before we get into that, I decided I thought, oh, let's just remind everybody because Saturn is the element of Earth. And as these outer planets travel through the elements, fire, earth, air, water, they are having a tendency with climate change to really kind of show us patterns of where the climate is speaking up and saying, I'm not very happy with how you are treating me these days, meaning Gaia, planet Earth. Saturn and Aquarius made us aware of wind events, tornadoes becoming longer more often. It included the forest fires when it was in Aquarius. We're just finishing up with Saturn in Pisces, which is a water element. How many of you now know what an atmospheric river is? It's when the air is so saturated with water that and then it comes off the oceans and it doesn't rise real high and it just creates these very strong downpours of moisture. We've noticed that not so much maybe in the West, although I think they've gotten them too. But as we move Midwest, and those of you who live on the East Coast, you're really noticing that. Saturn and Aries, I'm kind of expecting that we'll have some of these fire events coming back up. However, we're having Uranus in Gemini, Neptune in the Aries, and Pluto in Aquarius. Those are all fire and air elements, and now Saturn going into fire. You can expect more of our wildfires coming up, and not just necessarily in our rural areas. Los Angeles proved that one earlier this year. But I just thought, just a little reminder for all of us there. I kept in the Saturn astronomy slides that I created a long time ago because I kind of think it's an interesting planet with astronomy. As you can see, almost 3 decades around the zodiac, 2.5 years in a sign, one retrograde every year, approximately 140 days when it goes retrograde, and when it goes direct, it has a tendency to just stand still in the sky for 5 days on each of those periods. Now, Saturn is like Earth. It is not perfectly round. It's kind of fatter in the middle. But it's the interesting thing is how many moons Saturn has. Now that those rings that you see going around Saturn, they're only half a mile thick. But Saturn has 53 officially named moons and 29 unofficial moons. And it's those moons orbiting Saturn that create the gravity that causes those rings. So I just thought that was a little interesting tidbit for you. And so here's just a picture of Saturn and its rings. I'm a Capricorn rising, so I've always liked Saturn. I've always gotten along with the archetype of Saturn, Capricorn, 10th house. Leroy will tell you sometimes too much. And so let's start looking at this archetype of Saturn. And because it's going into Aries and it's starting a brand new cycle, I thought it's good to just review Saturn on an archetypical level, because everything that we're going to look at from its archetypes is going to carry through with different flavors over the next 3 decades. And so these are some of those little bullet points you can look at. So in evolutionary astrology, we know Saturn as a structure of the individuated consciousness. It is the outer boundaries carrying Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Mercury, Moon, Sun within it. And so it's what we know on a conscious level that we can easily access. Now, if you are by any chance a practicing astrologer, or you just want to do a deep dive into your own individuated consciousness, here's what you look at. You look where your natal Saturn is by sign, house, and aspects. What are the rulers of the sign Saturn's in, the house Saturn's in, their sign, house aspects? Then you look at the sign that's on the 10th house cusp. And what's its planetary ruler? Are there any planets in the 10th house? And where is Capricorn in the chart? Are there planets in Capricorn? And where are they by their house and aspects? This is the complete picture of the archetype of Saturn. And it will, again, in its totality, describe your own individuated state of, not your state of consciousness, but kind of how you structure the boundaries of what you are aware of in your world. As you can see, Jeffrey used to say, we humans are complicated. Well, this just shows you how vast our own nature of our consciousness is. Again, it's the foundation of how we put everything together in our world. And so all those other planets, those inner ones and the outer ones, they're filtered through Saturn. They're defined by Saturn. And so that structure of consciousness, Saturn, boundaries of what I'm comfortable with, it doesn't always like it when that unconsciousness pops things up into the surface, some spontaneous memory or some woundedness through religious patriarchal distortions. Doesn't always like those kind of things that pop up. And so Saturn always wants to take that unconsciousness and kind of suppress it back down. Exception to the rule: if you were born with Saturn retrograde on a natal basis, it's like you're opening the door to what's below the surface and saying, "Come on up and out. Let's deal with it. Let's talk about it. Let's address it." And so people who have Saturn retrograde natally, they can access the unconsciousness easier than those of us who were born with Saturn direct. Now, one of the things to recognize is we can have Saturn go retrograde by progression. If you're born with it retrograde, you can have it go direct by progression. Doesn't mean it's going to happen for everybody in a lifetime, but that needs to be taken into consideration as you work with any forecasting for yourself in your chart or with any clients. Now, Saturn retrograde is the natural rebel. It's wanting to rebel against authority. And I always like to say the first authority are the parents. So those Saturn retrograde souls, they rebel against their parents. The intent of being born with Saturn retrograde is to throw off all of societal or consensus conditioning factors and return to our own inner sense of self, our own inner authority, and who we are as an individual versus what society says we are supposed to do and be and etc. And so remember this: when Saturn goes retrograde, those 4 months out of the year, we're all having a mini rebellion of wanting to throw off again conditioning and find who we are. Saturn relates to what we call the maturation process, and that's always going to be relative to our environmental conditionings. What country were you born in? What type of parental environment did you have? Were there any religious influences? What are the social and cultural influences that you were born into and or raised with? All of that's going to have its conditioning on how you mature. Now, what the maturation process means is that we have to become self-responsible. We have to accept responsibility for our own actions, our own efforts, our own results, no matter what. And especially once you reach that first Saturn return, which comes in your late 20s, and you've had one cycle of Saturn around the zodiac, you're an adult now, according to astrology, and you are responsible for anything and everything. There's no more blaming your parents. There's no more blaming the society or financial conditions you were born into. It's now up to you to start that second Saturn cycle. Be responsible. What do you want to create? It's also self-determination. In order to do that creative aspect, you have to find that Saturnian will to get out of bed, to go to work, to set your goals, to make your efforts, to take charge of your life is one of the things that we say when planets transit up in that 10th house. We want to call it the career, but it's self-determination. It is where you take charge of your own life, again, within the perimeters of the space-time environmental conditionings you were born into. It is also, when we mature, how we establish our own individual authority within society. We can do that through a job or a career. We can do that as we become parents ourselves. We can do that as we choose where we want to live on planet Earth. But again, it is that maturing process of becoming an adult in the world and participating in it. Saturn also relates to what we call the boundaries of space time or linear time, day by day, week by week. And that teaches us the issue of mortality. Jeffrey Green used to teach by the time Saturn makes it the first quarter of the square around the chart from itself, about 7, 8 years old, that is when a soul becomes aware of its own mortality, that it doesn't live forever. It's going to be here for a finite time. Also, what I like to say within these boundaries of space time, as we go from child to adult to elder, this is where we have to deal with all of our social obligations as well. And sometimes with the patriarchal distortions, and especially if you look what's going on politically in the USA right now, we are not always very good at taking care of children and elders. We sometimes have a pretty failing grade in this country, regardless of how rich we are, in meeting societal obligations as a group. And of course, as I've been saying before, we look at Saturn in its totality. It's all these conditioning factors of the consensus environment. I briefly call them environmental conditionings. We all have them. We're all raised with them. We all have to figure out how to work within our own environment of space-time. So when Saturn goes into Aries, all of us are going to initiate a new cycle of how we want to structure our world, how we want to create it in form. And we recognize it in consciousness first, and that sparks some of those ideas that the Mars-Pluto pair for our soul's desires works to achieve. Saturn has a role in that. I like to say I don't, my consciousness isn't interested in having 10 designer purses. Don't care. And you can all decide within your own structure of consciousness, because again, the Venus values and needs and the Mars desires, they all operate through Saturn, helping them achieve it. So here we are with these new beginnings. Now it's going to create rebellion against what we have before. If you've been paying attention, as Saturn has been moving through Pisces, it's been finishing up. Been there, done that. Oh, I used to think this was important to me, and now I'm just so ready to let this go. Sometimes we don't want to let things go. And when planets move through Pisces, the universe says, doesn't matter. That time is done. You can choose to walk away, or we will dissolve it for you. So we got this goodbye, hello going on, and now here are the hellos coming. And what happens with that archetype of Aries, because it is the first archetype of the zodiac, it has issues around insecurity. It wants that freedom to do whatever it wants, but it's like as we say with all the cardinal archetypes, but it's really expanded in Aries. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We go forward till we become insecure, then we retreat back to security, then we go forward till we're insecure. So we vacillate between I got this, that new phrase everybody uses these days, and oh gosh, I can't do this. No, I can't do this. I'm falling apart. We're all going to go through this with Saturn in Aries, and it's your own way of teaching you where you have security issues. More on that in just a little bit. However, these new cycles that we're all initiating of how we want to structure our world, how we want to choose to participate in the world, they're all going to be relative to our chronological ages. We're not all going to be doing it the same way. And regardless of our chronological age, Saturn in Aries says you will still initiate a new maturation cycle. Kids, they want their freedom. They don't know boundaries. They want to do whatever it takes. They're going to run into those Libra polarities that says, you can't do that yet. You're not old enough to drink beer or whatever. They're going to run into the higher powers that are just going to say, not yet. There's a little more maturing you've got to do to get there. Middle age, this might feel some of the most frustration, and I use middle age widely, okay? Functioning adults, okay? Working adults, they can feel some of the biggest frustrations because they've got all the obligations. We got rent or mortgage. We've got a relationship that we may be participating in. We may be in the middle of raising children. We've got the structure to our life that says we have to do this and that and this and that to create the resources for everything to function in our world. And we can go through wanting to just blow it up. And there might be those that do blow it up. However, we also have to learn how to maintain. That's one of the things about Saturn, Capricorn 10th house, is that, again, and there's two steps forward, one step back. Aries just wants to throw it to the smithereens. And Saturn says, oh, I can release this and move forward this way and establish that. Then I can release that and move forward that way and establish that. In other words, it's just got to have almost that mechanical process through space time when we are in the middle of being a functioning adult, so to speak, and most likely still in that work world. So, how do you move forward as you maintain what you've built up to this point? Now, if you are quote unquote moving towards being an elder, you have to make peace with what you can and cannot do in the physical world. I find myself sometimes stating to people, and again, I've always, been buddies with Capricorn. I find myself stating to people, I'm almost 70 years old. I don't know if I can do that. Usually it will involve some type of activity. Like I can't hike necessarily 6, 7 miles anymore. I got to go back to that 3 to 4 mile range. Just an example. So again, even in your wisening elder years, where are new beginnings showing up for you? And you may have some sparks going on with Saturn and Aries. And it's quite possible that some of these sparks are going to be ideas that maybe you will fully manifest in a future life. For instance, you could have always wanted to take piano lessons. Well, you can take piano lessons in your elder years. You can learn new talents in your elder years, but they may not be something that you can do as a job that brings you resources. In other words, you may be learning new things that actually are setting you up for future lives. We get so interested in the past that sometimes it's like what's unfinished within you, and how can you work with that within your space-time parameters to lay foundations. It's just a natural for Saturn. Now, one of the things that we always work with the Cancer Capricorn polarity or Moon and Saturn is what we in EA call the anima animus, our feminine energy, our masculine energy. Animus is energy returning to the center. Animus is energy moving out from the center. And one of the ways that we talk about it here is as our souls expand in consciousness, those evolutionary states of consciousness, consensus, individuating, spirituating that EA talks about, as we are expanding in that individuating, spirituating consciousness, we start to ask this question when we are female, how do I balance with my inner male? And if we're a male, how do we balance with our inner female? I happen to be doing a lecture in Seattle Memorial Day weekend on Pluto and Aquarius effect on sexuality. And so I do a deep dive into all of this. The actual conference physically sells out quite fast, but you can still participate in the virtual conference, and you can go check on their website and see exactly how you can find more about my lecture if you are interested. One of the things to recognize as our souls expand in consciousness, soul evolution is balancing our anima, animus, regardless of our current gender. Meaning, over many, many lifetimes, we incarnate female, we incarnate male in order to learn that soul androgyny. So I'm not going to go into it anymore right now. It's a big subject right now. I'll say one thing. If you think that at the end of Pluto Capricorn and the beginning of Pluto and Aquarius, you can stomp down all of our gender freedoms, Saturn and Aries square them, not gonna happen. Not gonna happen. I got a cute little slide to show you in a little bit on that. Back to some of these archetypes for Saturn. So the anima animus. So that Saturn, that growing up, maturing process, included in that are all of our gender, hormonal, childhood, and parenting issues. Cancer, fourth house, moon has its side of it. We're just going to look at the Saturn side of it for right now. And so here again, balancing that inner male and female. But what we want to work with, and this is something we can especially do with Saturn and Aries, this is the archetype where we remember that self-responsibility. This is where we are responsible for healing our own childhood wounding by accepting, this is reincarnation here, that we choose our parents. And when you recognize that, oh gosh, I mean, it can be so healing for you. You stop blaming the parent. They're imperfect. They were just doing the best they could do in the space-time context of raising you. So how can you work with healing yourself? How can you accept responsibility for yourself? By the way, you can look at your chart and whatever you have on that 10th house cusp, and you can go back to Saturn and you can put the moon in there when I gave you the signs and the houses and the rulers right at the beginning. You can replace that with moon and Cancer if you want to, because in general, that 10th house cusp is our maturing parent. You can find that on your chart. And that 4th house cusp is your nurturing parent. And so we are dealing with, again, that ability to mature and take charge of our own life and parent ourselves, being, responsible, but then also going to that Saturn, and we can do this when Saturn's retrograde, going to that polarity, Cancer 4th house, and how do I heal? So do your best. Get yourself the Saturn and Aries freedom with it. Saturn also represents consensus society. In EA, when we look at those expanding states of consciousness, that consensus world is approximately 10, excuse me, 7 out of 10 souls on the planet, regardless of the country, regardless of their race, regardless of the uh, type of society that they were born into, regardless of whether they're male or female. The majority of us run around in consensus society. We allow ourselves to be conditioned by whatever the current norms are that we are operating in. So, consensus society creates rules, norms, taboos, laws that allow groups of people to function together. And it's necessary because without it, we have anarchy and anything goes. And, you know, the traffic accidents increase because we don't have stoplights or stop signs. So, we need consensus society. But Saturn in Aries is going to have us breaking free from norms, taboos, laws that we feel just does not work for us anymore. There are those in consensus society that will say, well, I've never looked at reincarnation, but I might be a little open to it. And it's a true statement. I mean, I've had conversations with consensus people who actually express that. But that consensus society where we create our rules and norms, there's no acceptance of reincarnation. If there was, we would treat all of these LGBTQ plus issues differently. So, it kind of, again, Saturn presses that down under the surface. Reincarnation, by the way, was taken out of the Bible in 325 AD at the First Council of Nicaea, if you want to go check facts out for yourself. Saturn in Aries, again, it's going to stir up conflicts, more conflicts for people, children, parents, political rulers around all these gender hormonal issues. It's going to stir things up around childing and parenting issues. What do we have going on right now in the US? We're trying to take away the SNAP, which is food stamps for children, push that onto the states. We're trying to, take millions of people off of Medicaid, which is health insurance for disabled and elderly. And so it's going to be interesting if Saturn in Aries and the Republicans in Washington, D.C. get away with this and what kind of follow through or backlash, that 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that literal space time that we live in with Saturn. It's going to be a little interesting, and it's going to really stir the pot if they take away so much of our social support systems. And so, again, Saturn in Aries around these gender and hormonal issues about how we parent our children. It's going to come down to the freedom to do what we want as long as we're not hurting anybody and we're being respectful, versus that Pluto and Capricorn consensus society projecting forward into Aquarius and saying, you can't do this, you can't do that, you got to go back to the 1950s, and we like women to just sit at home in their apron strings and cook. Whew. As I have been saying, you're not going to put the genie back in the bottle. And so, when you look at this whole subject of genders and hormones and children and parents and our seniors and elders that we, as a society have responsibility to care for, who has the courage to create change in those ways? I do think there's, again, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. They can try and take things away, but I think Pluto and Aquarius is going to bring out tax the rich like we've never seen it if they try to do that. that Saturn in Aries is stirring it up as to who's got authority, who's showing up and taking authority, who's gaining authority, who's losing it. And as we know from thousands of years of patriarchal distortions, those in power do not want to give it up. And that's why I think there's going to be so much conforming pressure on the Republican Party in general to get done what they want to get done this year, next year, because after the midterms in 28, they're not going to be able to take away social support systems as much as they want. Taxing the rich to have the middle class and poor pay for it sounds like a winning formula, right? Saturn Aries might have something to say about it. I expect that the social unrest is going to come back. And it can also bring back the violence, the physical violence, the sexual violence, the gun violence, the anger in all its many ways. I mean, if you've been watching I deliberately call it Doggy, Elon Musk, and the thousands of workers in the federal government that have been, fired. And are we safe to fly? Is our food safe to eat? We're going to watch that physical space time trickle down or showing up in manifestations with this new Saturn cycle about how backwards this country is taking us. Thank you, international listeners. My filter is the USA. So that's why I'm saying throughout this 2.5 years of Saturn in Aries, we can expect that social unrest and activism to just have a whole reset if things go the way Republicans are trying to take them. Democratic Party, they're doing their own Saturn and Aries reset. Got a slide for you on that in just a moment. Back to the archetypes again. So here is Saturn, Capricorn, 10th house. These are our social positions of leadership in any country in that consensus consciousness of 70%. Who's in charge of the country? Who leads the country? Who's in the legislature or the parliament? Who has the power? Who has the control and authority? Who doesn't? And so we, again, are going to really see a lot of this Pluto and Capricorn stuff try to carry itself forward. And there will be ways, there will be countries where it happens because of that consensus mass. But there will also be situations where, now that we have Pluto and Aquarius, the rebellions come about and the backlash and the desire to break free from that old Capricorn stuff. It's going to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. In some ways, Saturn in Aries is really going to give us that energy to activism and change in the areas where we need it. And when you look at it from the perspective of the climate, you realize that doesn't matter what the laws are. If we're going to, take away all our regulations and, drill baby drill, and by the way, that's not really going to happen because the writing's on the wall. It's kind of like there's just going to be change. And Saturn is the demarcation of it in space-time in Aries. One of the other archetypes of Saturn, and this comes from that consensus consciousness and consensus society, is what we call standards of right, wrong conduct. Remember, we need the laws, we need the rules so that we all obey traffic signs to, not have so many fender benders with each other. And so we have those, but we also can create standards of right, wrong conduct. Again, two people of the same sex do not have the freedom to live together or, marry each other or choose to have children however they want to. There's areas around the world where that is not allowed, and we're trying to back down off of that. Well, Saturn in Aries is going to come along and look at these and go, well, I don't know about that. Think we need to create a few changes. We also, when we're dealing with the Capricorn archetype, it is the third of the Earth archetypes: Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn. Saturn rules Capricorn. So Taurus is all the physical resources. Virgo is that detailed work we do to create resources. And Capricorn is the accumulation of all those resources and how we manage them. So, how do we create the laws that we many times will refer to as income taxes so that people pay in to then manage how we want infrastructure, how we want to pay for those stop signs and roads without potholes? And so, from the perspective of evolutionary astrology, all of those value systems around resources, Taurus's values of resources, they come down to two different types: inclusive versus exclusive. You see them here on your screen: inclusive giving, sharing, and including; exclusive taking, hoarding, and excluding. And this is the big bottom line. These are the patriarchal distortions going on. And this is what we see Elon Musk and Donald Trump and family doing at the moment. So here, one more slide. I may have repeated some of this already. So when Saturn goes into Aries again, we're going to look at these standards of right, wrong conduct and say, don't agree with this one, needs to change. And as you can see, whether it's religion, our rules and laws, our social support systems like Medicaid, Medicare, elder care, whether it's our legal world, every area of life has standards of what consensus calls right, wrong conduct. And Saturn in Aries is going to look at all of them. And they're all going to be facing pressure anywhere on the planet to change because of these outer planets ingressing into new signs. It's kind of like, hold on to your hat, button up your coat, secure yourself, because this decade is just going to be change, change, change. And because these outer planets are going to transit the signs from 7 to 14 to 20 years, it's going to take a while before the chaos unfolds and we know exactly which way we're going to go. Saturn in Aries is meant to shake it up. Naturally so, to leave that past behind and move forward. So, how are we going to have conversations around our resources? How much anger is going to arise, as I've been saying, when they realize that, oh, by the way, we have some empty shelves, or we can't afford this with tariffs because these guys got tax cuts. So we could pay for them. Anyway, you get what I'm saying. So you've heard me say this. I am beginning to wonder. I just think that the Republican Party, I'm not a Donald Trump fan, it's my filter. I think they are going to just go for a grab for as much as they can get, as I just said a little while ago. And they're going to overplay their hand, including Donald Trump. And there will be some backlash and anger coming out at them. Here's one tiny little small example. Yesterday, I live in South Dakota. Nebraska is one of our neighbors. Um, the Democratic candidate, who's a former police officer, he beat the three-time Republican incumbent in the Omaha, Nebraska mayor's race. And this was his sign. She, some, a political group that was in support of her sent out a mailer lambasting him about his support of transgender kids and the extremes of how they're talking about all of that. He fought back and he just said, she's focused on potties and I'm focusing on potholes. And he spent his entire campaign talking about bread and butter issues and working with infrastructure and dealing with the issues of government, stop signs, instead of these cultural issues that, very few of us are interested in. So this is one of the, again, this is one of his ads, digital print and everything. Oh, he beat her 56 to 44%. And if you're not familiar with this, Nebraska is a pretty solid Republican state. The city of Omaha kind of splits itself into two districts. It's one of two states that takes its electoral votes, two of them, and they give one usually to Omaha, and then there's usually one with all the surrounding suburbs and the rural part of Nebraska that gets the other electoral vote, the rural vote and the urban vote. However, just the fact that she's been won her memorial race three times, and 56 to 44 is a blowout in that state. So here's an idea of what may be coming down the road. Now, one of the last things we'll look at here is that when we're dealing with this Cancer Capricorn Moon Saturn archetype, the Saturn Capricorn side of it is outer security, it's earth. So it's that physical world and it's that accumulation of physical resources and that physical environment around it, be it our relationships or our job or our house, or how we put things together that we've manifested that make us feel secure. That is always transitory. That's always a physical security that's not timeless. And so one of the things that happens, and this comes from Saturn Capricorn 10th house being passive polarity, energy returning to center. When that outer security or all of that material world no longer serves us, we have the whole principle of involution, compression, depression, energy moving back inward. When those outer realities and circumstances no longer serve us, what it does is it forces us to go inward and reflect. Oh, why do I need that big house? Why do I need those 10 designer purses? Why do I need XYZ? So that can be removed to turn us inward and we become aware of why we want what we want. But we also become aware of what we call inner security, the Moon Cancer fourth house side. That out there is only as good as we are in here. And so it teaches us an inner acceptance of ourself, regardless of our outer role in society and regardless of the circumstances in our life. In other words, inner security leads to outer security. One more time, it's outer is reflective of here. You don't like it there, you got to change it here. It's that E equals MC squared. You know, you can't destroy energy. You just change its form. Okay. And so, as we learn to work on that energetic level, that inner level, we can learn how to change those forms out there. We can go beyond Saturn. Can't do it in 5 minutes, as I like to say. Okay. And so, one more thing, that natural structure of consciousness, Saturn, is outer security reflecting inner and changing, adapting as necessary with natural evolution. Well, guess what Saturn in Aries is going to do? It's that 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Remember, we go and explore, act, react. We want all that Aries freedom till we're insecure. Then we go inward. Can you see how this now can relate to Saturn as an archetype? And so instead of judging the implosions or the inner time periods, oh, what am I to learn? How am I to deepen my inner security? How am I to deepen my inner emotional self reliance? How do I rely on myself to meet all my needs, inner and outer? And then we can ebb and flow with this brand new cycle that Saturn in Aries is creating for all of us. I just want to say that with these outer planets ingressing new signs and Saturn doing it for 2.5 years and Jupiter doing it next month, it can just really feel like everything is speeding up. So we also want to make an effort to just be at peace in our physical world just as much as we can. Again, outer, inner. We go back and forth with that how many times a day and how many times in a month or a year or a Saturn in Aries as the situations come up. And so what you can do with Saturn moving into Aries is just ask yourself, what are my new beginnings? What am I wanting to initiate here, taking charge of my life? How is it showing up for me in my physical space-time world? How can I work with it as best as possible? How can I create that inner security to make whatever changes I have to make in the outer world? All of us can be feeling somewhat financially insecure with choices Donald Trump has made in his stubbornness, we shall call it. Most of the world has been able to figure out that tariffs are taxes on the people. And he's learning it, perhaps the hard way. Time will tell. But all of us can kind of feel some of that insecurity with our outer world right now. Well, how do we learn to do with less? What is our value system and our priorities for what's really important for us as we live in our particular space-time environment? All right, I'm going to go through the cycles here. All right, I'm going to take a drink of water. Are there, if I pause, are there any questions? Is there anything about Saturn or Aries that I've not exactly covered that anybody has questions about? Don't necessarily have my chat pane open, Leroy, so.
No, you're fine. You're
Okay.
fine.
All right. Thank you very much, honey. All right. Um, I ran through the last 100 years of Saturn in Aries. In other words, we had three Saturn and Aries cycles in the 20th century, the 1900s. And as I was kind of doing a little bit of my research, I decided, oh, I did the late 30s and I did the late 60s and I did the late 90s. And I was kind of like, oh, I think it's more interesting by subject matter. So I just went through and put things down for you. And found that Saturn in Aries, there were a lot of initiations of relationships. George the Sixth and Elizabeth. And this is Elizabeth II. This is her mother, okay? In case you were wondering, she didn't come to the crown until the early 50s. But this George inherited the crown when his brother, the Duke of Windsor, left to marry Wallis Simpson, the American divorcee. Remember? That happened Saturn in Aries. Oh, by the way, our Dalai Lama, who is still with us in a physical body, he was discovered in Saturn in Aries. And I saw that and I went, oh, I wonder if he will be with us through this Saturn in Aries. Elvis Presley got married. The Supreme Court in the 60s shot down prohibitions to interracial marriages. Golda Meir, first Prime Minister of Israel. Oh, John Lennon and Yoko Ono got married with Saturn in Aries. As I looked at those, I went, oh, I wonder if Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce will get married with Saturn in Aries. Stay tuned. Princess Diana passed and sat with Saturn in Aries in her car accident. Again, these are just little snapshots for you to give you some ideas, and a lot more goes on in this area. I just kind of bullet pointed them down to one slide. Nylon came about by DuPont, one of the first plastics and synthetics. By the way, the first nylon toothbrush came about with Saturn in Aries. LSD, nuclear fission of uranium, which is what created the nuclear powers. Hewlett Packard, HP, anybody? I got an HP laptop founded in Silicon Valley in 39. Boeing was founded. Um, this one is wrong. Should be 37. Hold on a second. Yeah, that Boeing one is 1937. Okay, didn't get that corrected. However, first heart plant, Hot Wheels, the semiconductor company Intel. Boeing flew a jumbo jet for the first time one Aries cycle later. And oh, by the way, an American teenager died from a condition, a medical condition. They didn't know what it was. And they later found out that it was AIDS, HIV. Remember the Apollo moon landing? How many of you can remember that one? How about Dolly the sheep? Netflix was founded in Saturn and Aries. It's kind of different initiations in different ways. Politics and government. Huh. The Marijuana Tax Act was passed in the late 30s, outlawing the consumption of cannabis. And they decided to call it the Marijuana Tax Act instead of the Cannabis Tax Act. Cannabis has been used for at least 10,000 years, okay? Because marijuana is a Mexican word, in the government or the politicians back in the late 30s, they tried to create prejudice by calling it the Mexican weed, marijuana. This is the time period of Adolf Hitler, concentration camps, and of course, the start of World War II. Go forward, Six-Day War with Israel and Islamic countries. Vietnam War and its protests, which were much more violent than anything we saw in 2020. Beatles music mania. I don't quite remember that. I was a little late to the music scene. I was listening to my mother and aunt's oldies music when I was growing up. Off the gold standard. Oh, we all remember 68 with Martin Luther King and RFK assassinated 2 months apart. Stonewall riots, which was a club in New York City where they came and tried to shut down this gay club, turned into riots. Australia, first one, maybe not the first, but one of the first to ban private possession of semi-automatic and automatic rifles. It'll be interesting to see what this Saturn and Aries cycle does with the whole issue of gun control in the United States. Our European Central Bank and the Euro was created in the last Saturn and Aries cycle. Nature. Now, nature has been having things going on the whole time. It's not like we haven't ever had earthquakes or hurricanes or typhoons, etc. I just put a few of them down. Probably the one that really stands out here is that back in those 30s and the beginnings of World War II, Japan was trying to take over China. And the government of China literally flooded a river that ended up killing 400,000 citizens of its own country. I was like, whoa, that's interesting. How about this one? 1939, a 5-year-old girl in Peru gives birth to a baby boy. It is the earliest birth documented. Still the earliest. Santa Barbara oil spill in the 1960s. It is what inspired the 1970s Earth Day, in case you are interested in that. I remember this one here back in the late 90s. The Red River, I live in Western South Dakota. I was born in Southeastern South Dakota, and I'm doing it backwards. In Northwestern South Dakota, the Red River starts and it runs north and it empties into the Hudson Bay in Canada. And it's known for vast flooding. Well, it broke through its dikes, didn't have a lot of deaths, but in the 90s, it caused $2 billion worth of damages. I use this as an example in my public banking because the Bank of North Dakota is its own mini central bank, and it doesn't let any of its assets go to Wall Street. They stay in, I call it Main Street. They keep track of them themselves, and the interest that they earn comes back in. They paid for their own kind of FEMA support. They got reimbursed from the federal government, but they had the cash on hand that they immediately went in and had the National Guard and local police forces and firemen and just citizens that just recovered the public in regards to houses being flooded and all the infrastructure damage that went on. They repaired it in an extremely super fast way because, again, they had their own cash on hand. It's another story, other subjects. You can go to my YouTube channel, Evolutionary Astronet, research the public banking revolution. I talk more about it in there. You can also go to publicbankinginstitute.org if you would like to find out more information on public banking versus private banking. I put a lot of slides on that in Saturn and Pisces too. And I thought, okay, I'm going to look like I'm repeating myself. I didn't do it for Saturn in Aries because we've got some aspects that are going to be going on in this Saturn in Aries retrograde cycle. You can take this slide, you can replace Saturn with Jupiter or Mars or Uranus. Whenever a transiting planet goes retrograde, it's always related back to that natal planet's archetype by sign, house, and aspects, because that natal archetype is going to be looking at past, looking at conditioning, and trying to break free when the forecasting planet of the same archetype, Saturn to Saturn, is retrograde. So Saturn specifically, as we said before, throwing off those conditioning patterns to open the door to the unconsciousness. I include Chiron in the outer planets these days. Saturn retrograde archetype, we're going to throw off all that stuff. Saturn is so much of that consensus world that wants us to conform. Well, guess what? Saturn retrograde is going to throw off those environmental conditioning factors. It's going to increase that involution, compression, depression, all those inner dynamics that are going on, and learning to have a greater inner acceptance of ourself, regardless of that outer world. All that gets emphasized by Saturn's retrograde. Here's its dates. 2 retrograde cycles fully in Aries, and this particular one is going to go back into Pisces. Saturn's going to go retrograde 25 degrees back into Pisces. So we're still going to be dealing with some of that stuff. Now, Saturn in Aries retrograde in Libra. The intent is to rebalance both inner and outer world. Deepening that inner security allows for an evolution of our relationship with ourself, but it also then is about working on relationships with others, because Libra is the psychology of listening. And Saturn in Aries may want to interrupt. It wants to convince and convert. It's about, it's me, me, me. You need to just do what I say. You need to follow me. We'll all be okay. Well, it goes retrograde and everybody else is going, I'm not going to follow you. I don't agree with you. And so its retrogrades are going to emphasize a time period to search for new levels of equality and fairness in all relationships, individually, collectively. It does not mean we give up our own sense of authority. But if we're secure in here, if we're going in here to work on it, then we can take the feedback from others. We can do the Libra compare and contrast. Oh, I agree with that idea. Well, that's a smart idea. I think I'm going to try that one out. We can go that yes, no, rather than being my way or the highway, Aries. So, how are our relationships going to evolve through those 3 Saturn retrograde in Aries pointing to Libra polarities? Libra is about when to give and when not to give, and when not giving is the greater giving. So every time Saturn's retrograde in Aries pointing towards Libra, that whole issue of giving and receiving is going to come up for us. It will come up specifically in intimate relationships, square Cancer with family, square Capricorn, work and career. Am I being paid fairly for what I want? Oh gosh, what's going to happen with all of the advances of AI and taking how many people out of jobs? If we look at this for a moment on a collective level, we're going to have to figure out some way of supporting people with food, clothing, and shelter. You think the Industrial Revolution modernized things and created social unrest and took away jobs when 80% of people lived off the farm, and now we barely have 2% living off the farm, raising the food. Everybody moved to the cities. Remember all that back in the 1800s? Specifically, this is the Uranus Neptune conjunctions, the ones in the 1820s really exacerbated the Industrial Revolution and all the unrest. And it's what led to the unions and the marching in the street and the 40-hour work weeks. Then we had the Uranus Neptune conjunctions of 1993, again in Capricorn, the information revolution, but it was the technological revolutions. And now with AI, it's going to make the jobs lost and the social disruptions of the Industrial Revolution look like peanuts. So we're going to have to figure out ways. And by the way, universal basic income, go research it if you care to. We're going to have to figure out ways to, again, food, clothing, shelter people when there's not enough jobs to go around. And Saturn retrograde, or excuse me, Saturn making a cycle through Aries is going to demand we address that over the next 30 years. And when it's retrograde, stir the pot, stir the pot, stir the pot, because Libra, the public, and Libra, the people, don't, they have to stand up for themselves. So, how well can we actually look at how things affect others, Aries, beside ourselves? That famous phrase, walk another mile in somebody else's shoes or moccasins, I think that's where it started. It increases our sensitivity around others. Those unconscious memories want to come up. We also can have a chance of maturing, especially if we have unconscious memories coming up, for instance, from past lives. And, we didn't get to grow into adulthood because the famine hit, or the animal charged us and ran over us and we didn't kill it, when we were out doing the hunting rites of passage. Saturn retrograde, Libra polarity, we can have second chances of maturing individually and with others and through others. It will increase recognizing where we have exhausted any outer forms that don't serve us, and how do we let go and let the new come in. And because this first retrograde in Aries is going to reverse back into Pisces, it's going to emphasize the letting go. Here are the slides I used last time when we looked at Saturn through Pisces for 2.5 years with retrogrades in Virgo. If our world collapses in this retrograde cycle back to Pisces, how do we put one foot in front of the other, going through any spiritual or mental crises? Okay. I won't spend a lot of time on these slides. You can go back and refer to these. You can print out the PDFs if you want to work with it during those time periods. Saturn's retrograde back to Pisces, Virgo polarity. It will bring those lessons of the Virgo discrimination, purification, self-improvement. How do we be gentle, diet, exercise, and rest? How do we make repeated efforts to change, change, change? So here's the chart for Saturn ingressing into Aries. I always use 0 Aries charts set up for Washington, D.C. We're going to have Jupiter square the nodes when it goes in late May here in just another, 10 days or so? Confusion. How do we move forward, initiate? It can represent that duality, for instance, in the US, where MAGA wants us to do one thing and progressives want us to do another. It can emphasize mental confusion. You want to just say, what does my instinct say to do? because we've got the stellium of planets in Aries saying, this is what feels right in my gut moving forward. We have Saturn getting ready to make 3 waxing sextiles to Pluto, increasing anger or desire for change. How? We'll look more at this. We got these balsamic conjunctions to Neptune. It is in with a balsamic conjunction phase, meaning the finishing up of a 360-degree cycle to Neptune all through this year. More in a minute on their conjunction. I use the Michael Mankesi chart with the Virgo rising at 9:37 a.m. for July 4th. Based upon all this material, I put this in for the last 5 years or so. Here's more information if you want to go get it. The biggest thing about any July 4th chart is there's 3 major aspects that always show how we have these waves between including versus excluding in the United States. Here's the ingress. We just so happen to have Saturn in that 7th house, Mankesi chart, of the public, of the people. Neptune's going to be there for a few years. Saturn's going to be there for probably a year and a half yet. It's been in there for at least, a year and a half. And so, how much public anger and unrest as the masses, 7th house, feel the pain of the austerity effects of the Republican political trifecta in the USA? Other countries, you can look at this conjunction from your own charts to figure it out. So, just want to point out to you that Saturn is in process of making these conjunctions to the outer planets. Remember in 2020 with COVID, when we had Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto make their conjunctions? Saturn's going to make 1 to Neptune in 26, 1 to Chiron in 28, 1 to Uranus in 32. So here it is, new phase Pluto moving forward on soul levels, but here it is balsamic to these 3, balsamic in a wide turn. So Saturn, that structure of consciousness and reality, everything is just breaking down, breaking down, breaking down. And as it makes these conjunctions, and at the beginning of the next decade, new waxing have to all of them, the building, the building, the building. We're going to see what breaks down yet. 1 waxing sextile to Pluto. I was wrong there. I thought there was 3. And so here's the 60-degree mark from that 2020 conjunction. It is within what we call that crescent phase. That's internalizing yin energy, is energy that is gestating to build new structures and realities. Jeffrey Green also always said, when a faster moving planet gets 60 degrees waxing sextile beyond the slower moving planet from their 0-degree initiation, new beginnings, it gets that 60 degrees. Those are very important choice points that are going to manifest the rest of the cycle around between those 2 planets. Pay attention to whatever future-orientated messages are coming forward for you on deep soul levels with Pluto. And how can Saturn Aries utilize any anger to move forward, to make these choices, to create what we want in the world? Now that they're only going to have that waxing sextile once, and it isn't going to come until 10 months from now, the beginning of 26. So it's quite possible that we can see that Saturn in Aries really wanting to help Pluto and Aquarius move forward. Stay tuned. We'll see. It's only one aspect, so it might not create a aha message for us, but you've got the knowledge to do something with it. I'm going to spend a bit of time on Saturn and Neptune and Saturn and Jupiter because they're the ones that are having the aspects. I've been putting this out for a little bit. Saturn and Neptune have a 34 to 36 year cycle together. And this particular one just happens to end and rebirth at 1 degree Aries. The beginning of Neptune's 165-year cycle is spiritual growth and evolution, and Saturn's 33-year cycle, no, Saturn's 28, 29-year cycle of how it wants to move forward. Just so happens that Saturn has been turning retrograde the same time as Neptune. After the conjunction in 26, 27, they're both going to turn stationary direct together. So an emphasis on releasing the old as they start retrogrades, and then an emphasis on really moving forward with new beginnings after their one conjunction. Let me show you this by dates, okay? Here they are going into Aries. Here they are turning retrograde, again, within, a week of each other. By the way, when Saturn and Neptune turned stationary retrograde a year ago, the end of June, sandwiched in between Neptune retrograde and 4 or 5 days later, Saturn retrograde, was Joe Biden and Donald Trump's presidential debate. I remember the depression. Saturn and Neptune, stationary retrograde, turning us inward. And, every Democrat in the country felt those two turn stationary retrograde in Pisces. So we're going to have one in Aries. How is it going to be anger busting forth in some way, somehow, with what's going on? They're going to go back into Pisces. Saturn's going to be in Pisces here for almost 5 months. Neptune's going to go back into Pisces for 3 months. So we still have both of them going back, working with those endings. Here's that conjunction. Here's the conjunction again. And here are the retrogrades in 26 and 27. When they're still turning, here's the stationary directs where they're pretty tandem with each other. These two can create a lot of frustration. Saturn moving into Aries is not gonna let Neptune in Aries be a wallflower. Might be a little too early to tell exactly how things are going to go forward for this, but Saturn pulling ahead of Neptune is going to say, I'm not letting go of you. You're coming along from the ride and you're going to help. Stay tuned. We'll see how that turns out. So we're still going to go through all of the rest of 2025 with Saturn waning Neptune, and a lot of it through Pisces. And can you just reflect on how we felt with Saturn waning Neptune in Pisces last year when Donald Trump was reelected, for those of you who were not in his favor? Can you see how we are looking at his administration, Elon Musk and the Republicans coming in and what they are doing with the destruction of this? I put this slide out 3 years ago. And I'm like, oh God. And then look at how things are, breaking down then with societal structures and how much we depend. The federal government is not in business of making a profit. It's in business of taking care of its citizens. Don't get me started. I'll let it go from there. So you can still work with this slide a little bit if you want to. Okay? But just remember, together, they're a 35-year cycle, manifesting form, Saturn, through consciousness, Neptune. Change your consciousness, change your energy, change your form. How is it being revealed to you, and how do you want to do it? It's going to be different for you than somebody in China or Africa. And again, consciousness is not necessary. Well, in the big scheme of things, it is formless. On individual soul basis, coming through form, the body reincarnating, lifetime after lifetime. It is that wide process of expanding consciousness. We're not going to leap from ABC to XYZ. So, our consciousness in any lifetime is going to be relative to whatever our soul's evolutionary requirements and lessons are. And yet, as Saturn goes new phase to Neptune, you've got some abilities to really reflect and change things. I know it's relative to your chronological age, but you can change things and you can heal things and you can set up new beginnings for your soul that you can carry forward into future lives, freeing yourselves perhaps from some of the Saturnian things you don't quite like. Throughout history, on a collective level, Saturn Neptune as a planetary pair has seen the rise and fall of democratic and autocratic principles between communism and democracy socialism. And if you want to see a real distinct example of that, go look at the history of the Soviet Union, the USSR, and look at it backwards over the last 150 years. And you'll see Saturn, Neptune, many times their conjunctions. And there were time periods because the history of Russia, and there's a book by an author called Edward Rutherford. Edward Rutherford, Rutherford, and he's the James Michener of Europe, so to speak. He writes about a geographical area over a long period of time, and each chapter is its own story of that geographical area through time. He wrote about Russia. There have been time periods in Russia's history when they really did try to do a healthy socialism. In other words, all the czars and the extremes that they came through. It would be harder for a country like Russia with their history to step into democracy. Whereas one of the things in the United States that's in our favor is we've literally had 250 years as a democracy with rule of law. And so while things are really being torn apart right now, it's going to be harder to destroy it than, say, some other areas of the world where they haven't experienced what we have on a collective level. And so Saturn, new phase Neptune, and going forward from their conjunction, by the way, at 045 Aries next February 26th, okay, within weeks after they go back into Aries. All right, remember that one? I mean, remember the second dates. I don't think I put those in here. Yep, second time they go into Aries, January 26th, 26 Neptune, February 13th, 26 Saturn. As this world becomes smaller through the expansion of electronics and time speeding up with information and how fast we can go, this Saturn new phase Neptune related to the four outer planets ingressing, there's possibility to really, really bring change to the world. You know, the renewable energies, the mobilization to rebuild social support system, global support for, the health crises that are going to come up for us, regardless of who is in charge of healthcare in the United States. We are going to continue to have more global crises with viruses and bacteria just because of the amount of people we have on the planet and how fast the viruses and bacteria can move with our travel. And of course, climate change is not going to stop. So, how are we going to, create new ways of going forward? Stay tuned. Um, this is such a subject. You can take the things that I've talked about with Saturn so far. You can go back and look at the Neptune in Aries webinar that I did a couple of months ago, and you can listen to those at your own leisure and use your own imagination, Neptune, about how we have choices of moving forward with these two planets in Aries and their new cycles. Just all areas of our life. Now, Saturn is still waning to Uranus, and they're going to have their waning sextiles, which they are in process of right now. Then they're going to have waning sesqui-squares during the time period Saturn is in Aries. Just a bullet point: survival and adaptability. Uranus and Taurus. Saturn, Earth. Survival and adaptability become major themes throughout the rest of the decade. Climate change. Survival crises force humanity to consider new choices for food, clothing, and shelter. They already say the dismantling of the USAID, where we spend 1% of our budget on foreign aid to support democracies around the world by giving people health care, stopping, AIDS, stopping the Ebola virus, stopping whatever, is going around with virus and bacteria. They say we're already starting to see the crises in, for instance, countries in Africa. And they say it's quite possible in the next few years, 10 million people could die. Remember when we had 40 million children a year die of hunger? And now we're down to maybe 5 million people or children a year die of hunger. This is breaking down some of those broader social structures, Saturn, Uranus, and their conjunction. This is the last one in 2032. Saturn have moved its way into Uranus's sign by then. Yeah, stay tuned. We'll see what the chaos is going to be during that time period moving into the next decade. But there's more aspects between Saturn and Uranus, but these are two of the major ones showing us some of the social system breakdowns. And with Uranus, some of them will be necessarily so. I'm all for autocratic countries breaking down. Some of the dangers, though, is increasing wars around resources such as technology needs the rare earth minerals to build almost anything of electronic basis. The AI world with its data centers, our electric vehicles, our phones, and our laptops that we like, all of our gadgets that we use to wash our clothes or air fryer, whatever stuff. And so it's possible we can see these two planets, create wars because Saturn and Aries can be aggressive. There will be the unrest. There will be the protests. There will be the violence in various ways and the wars in various ways that can break out. But also remember, necessity is the mother of all invention. Saturn in Aries with Uranus is going to speed up technological inventions. And even as they're balsamic each other or in their last two phases, their last quarter of a cycle with each other, Uranus is going to necessarily sow bust up Saturn where it's necessary. Again, just a short example here. Saturn waning Chiron is going to make one waxing semi-sextile. It already did. Chiron, being in Aries and then going into Taurus after Uranus, we're still, again, going to deal with the food, clothing, shelter. We're going to deal with the whole migration issue, the disease issues. Are we going to address things together or battle it out? Stay tuned. Okay, I got to tell you something. We're down to the last aspects. Um, as I was prepping today, I had it mainly done and I was just reviewing and I went, oh, I got to see what aspects Jupiter makes to Saturn the 2.5 years Saturn is in Aries. I was just looking at 2024 and 25. And remember, Jupiter's been making first quarter squares, crises in action. How do we build together societally with the new Jupiter Saturn 20-year cycle, expansion, contraction on social societal levels? I was like, oh, there's more than that. So then I started looking at aspects and I went, oh, something's wrong here. Something's wrong. Jupiter makes one trine to Saturn, waxing, but it makes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 waxing sesqui squares, square and a halves, gibbous phase to Saturn. That can't be right. Oh, excuse me, 3 trines. Then I went, oh, let me get this right. Yep, I got it. Then I went, oh, Jupiter is making 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 waxing inconjuncts to Saturn. And then it makes 5 oppositions to Saturn. I spent an hour, hour and a half going over the last 3 Jupiter Saturn cycles together, 20-year cycles, went back to 1980. Oh my God, they made 5 aspects, blah, blah, blah. Don't remember which ones. Went back to their 2000 conjunction. Remember they had 3 of them in Libra? Oh my gosh, there's 5 aspects. I thought my software was wrong. And then I got out the ephemeris and I checked them. You know, this little thing. I have been studying astrology 42, 43 years, and somehow I miss the fact that in Jupiter and Saturn's 20-year cycle together, they can sometimes make 5 of one aspect, 5 hits of one aspect. I was like blown away by this afternoon, and I was like, huh, you're always learning something new with astrology. So, it showed you 2 pages of dates. Let's look at this. Here was that last conjunction at 1/2 degree of Aquarius. What happened with this 20-year cycle of societal evolution is that Saturn and Jupiter have a tendency in their 20-year cycles to go through 200 years of conjunctions in one element. They just finished up 200 years of conjunctions in Taurus, Virgo, Capricorn. And it doesn't just go that way. It skips back and forth. Taurus, Virgo, Capricorn, Taurus, Virgo, Capricorn. It skips back and forth. And so now, with this conjunction that happened in 2020, we shifted to 200 years of Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions in the air element. So we have an emphasis on 200-year cycles shifting from the physical world to the mental world. Just look at that for a little bit with the Industrial Revolution and how much we had to physically create things that we wanted. And the days, 200 years ago, we still had to all grow our own food. Now look, here we are going forward 200 years with just these 2 in Gemini, Libra, Aquarius conjunctions, and the advent of AI and the technological electronic world. And I'm like, whoa, this is really, really interesting. And you don't look at Jupiter, Saturn from just technology. These two interface the Jupiterian beliefs to the Saturnian laws, and that can govern anything in our world. And so here we are with these first quarter squares. How are we physically continuing to adapt to this mental world of technological achievements? Oh, by the way, what's just started happening for us with our Zoom calls is I'm rattling off my voice for a couple of hours, and AI gives a synopsis of what I said when we click off the webinar. We're like, oh, I have to go through and read it. But so far as it's been doing that, I've been going, oh. By the way, as I was researching, I found things that were wrong with AI because I first of all asked the question on Google, can Jupiter make 5 aspects? Can Jupiter aspect Saturn? Anyway, make a single aspect 5 times. AI says no, so they're wrong.
We got to fact check that.
Huh?
We have to fact check that.
Fact check what? AI, our AI
Our
synopsis?
AI synopsis.
Yeah. Here are the 3 trines. Technological advancements exploding, how to keep up. Society is always tasked with ethics. Jupiter, monitoring the technology, the air sign or the fire signs that they're going through. Well, Pluto and Aquarius inequalities expand and exacerbate between social classes with these waxing trines. Part of that is because Uranus is going into Gemini this year. I got a webinar coming up on that. And it's going to make 5 waxing trines from 26 to 28 to Pluto and Aquarius. We made for a hot planet in multiple ways. The physical climate or social political climates. All species adapt or be left behind. Oh, by the way, I didn't put this in, but with Saturn in Aries over the last 3 cycles, there were various species that went extinct. A species of a deer, a species of a fish. They were not species that I knew real well, but it will happen. Here's the Wasking Sesqui squares, as astrologers are saying now. I learned how to say them as Sesqui squadrates, 135 years, moving into gibbous phase, self-reflection, self-analysis, 5 of them between Jupiter and Saturn, 3 with Aries, 2 with Taurus. Societal choices and policies are going to get feedback. Gibbous phase, energy moving inward. What's working, what's not working. This is where these years right here, here's where we can see, for instance, in the United States, where these social support systems are really breaking down, where we're having the health crises. Again, Jupiter and Saturn is how society functions together. Add financial crises in there with Virgo and Taurus. Have and have nots exposed even more. Stay tuned. We shall find out as it goes along. Here's the waxing inconjuncts or quincunxes, that aspect that happens within gibbous phase, 150 degrees. It's going to magnify, make that gibbous phase even more acute and noticeable in consciousness, Jupiter, Saturn. Here we're going to go 27, 28, 29. And so these 2 aspects then towards the end of this decade and these outer planet ingresses, because they're going to happen so many times, they're just really going to, again, accent what's working and what's not working for groups of people. Stay tuned. We'll see how they turn out. Finally, Venus and Mars retrograde cycles over the next few years do not interact with Saturn. So I just put down for you their oppositions and conjunctions. Venus will have 3 Saturn oppositions, and Mars will have 2. And they're all going to represent relationship choice points, how to balance, compromise, share, reach new understandings, because Saturn's in Aries and all those oppositions are going to happen with these 2 planets in Libra. Are we going to get along or fight? Mercury is going to have 2 retrograde cycles that interact with Saturn. The first one, I left this one in here because Saturn's going to go retrograde back into Pisces this year in 2025. Okay. And Mercury will make 3 waning trines to Saturn. These are water signs. This is going back to the emotions. This is going back to the resources. Scorpio can get involved with shared resources. And so I wonder if there aren't going to be some resource issues that may come up in the news. Waning trines, how are the haves going to take more from the have-nots is how I'm kind of looking at it. And then we're going to go all the way to 2027. And as Saturn's finishing up in Aries, we're going to have a Mercury retrograde that's going to have 3 oppositions. We'll see where relationships are going then. We will be hot and heavy into the USA presidential election of 28 because we now run 4-year presidential election cycles. Who has the louder voice in manifesting on planet Earth? Again, including or excluding. That's it. We did it. Whew. Thank you for hanging in there with me, everybody. Comments or questions for anybody? And I just realized something with my slides. I'm going to leave these in here. I did slides back. Remember I said I did some banking slides with Saturn in Pisces. That's when we were having a couple of the bank failures. I thought I took the slides out. I just stuck them on the end. So, hey, you guys can look at this. This is my soapbox. Ellen Brown is my heroine. You can take a look at these slides at your own leisure if you want to. I had the Federal Reserve in there. And of course, the Munkacy chart with the Federal Reserve. And again, when Saturn went into Pisces, we had 4 minor banks in the US go belly up, and our Federal Reserve and banking system came in and saved them. There's more in the Bank of North Dakota and what you can do. All right. So, comments or questions from anybody? Thank you for those of you who hung in there with me.
Have one question from Nona. Based upon the information tonight, what do you think about the Russian-Ukraine war? How's that playing out? Is there anything to say about that?
You know, I don't have, I'll see how fast I can pull out those charts because I did those charts. But let's just talk of it from a generic viewpoint at the moment, if I can find them. Just talking about it from a generic point of view with Putin and Russia's chart. Putin's going to drag his feet. He is just going to drag his feet. And I'm wondering, because the Saturn-Neptune cycles have been so strong in the chart of Russia, USSR before the Berlin Wall came down in 89 and after. I suspect that there might not be change in 25, but after February 26th, when Saturn goes new phase to Neptune in Aries together, that's when things are going to go one way or another in the Russia-Ukraine war. And, it's possible that even Donald Trump will finally get frustrated with them. I have pulled out their charts. So Vladimir Putin, October 752, St. Petersburg, Russia, no time. And he's been real secretive about the time, throwing out different various times so nobody believes him. He has 4 planets in Libra: Sun 14, Saturn 17, Neptune 21, Mercury 23. So from 14 to 23 degrees Libra. So we're going to probably have a couple of those Saturn and Aries retrograde cycles that are going to oppose his Libra planets. That could easily be a time period where he sees some of his power decimated because he's been in office, in power so long, and no one lives forever. And Russia, by the way, has the December 30, 1922 chart for Moscow at 8 p.m. They have, Russia has Saturn at 19 degrees Libra. So here's the Saturn retrograde cycles. I'm not going to rush through the slides. Saturn retrograde 26 is 15 to 8 degrees Libra. That is going to again oppose his Saturn, Putin's Saturn natally. And then Saturn retrograde in 27 is going to be 28 to 21 degrees Aries, and it's going to oppose Putin's Mercury 3 times. So it's not going to oppose Russia's Saturn in Libra 3 times, if that's going to be able to escape it. Russia itself might be okay in some way, but again, I don't know about Putin. He's going to hang in. He's going to hang on as long as he can. And I'm repeating myself. Get to Saturn new phase, Neptune in Aries, and I think Donald Trump will finally get frustrated. So hopefully that's helpful. Other questions?
Nope, you're clear.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. If you are following my slides, we will have Jupiter in Cancer coming up here in early June. We'll get our email notices out to you when that comes around. So thank you all very much for turning up live. Any of you who are watching the recording, thank you for wanting to work with EAN. All the best to everybody. Happy summer.